Have you ever had one of those projects where everything just goes completely wrong? Let me tell you a little story. Minas Tirith, yes, we're back here again. This build is rapidly becoming the biggest project I've ever worked on. In case you're new around here, quick recap. As COVID-19 descended upon the world, I launched a massive community project to build the mighty city of Gondor, aiming to create a full-scale wargaming board for Lord of the Rings Warhammer. As she currently stands, the outer ring wall is 4 meters long, and a whole host of folk all around the world are building walls, towers, buildings, including a whole bunch of fellow YouTubers who shall for now remain secret. But today we're tackling a very specific problem that such a massive board presents. How do we maintain a high level of detail across such a huge project? Smashing out bulk walls is pretty achievable by hand, as they rely on a lot of simple repeated forms that can be carved pretty quickly. But detailed components like buildings and stairwells descending from huge walls, these are always very detailed pieces that are hugely time intensive to make. Now there are a range of potential solutions that we'll be examining over the coming months, but today I'll be showing you guys my journey to carve a really nice stairwell once and then duplicating that piece as many times as I want through the power of really stupidly massive silicon molds. Strap in, Zorptrons, this is a bit of a bumpy ride. For those of you who've never worked with silicon before, it comes in 2 liquid components that when mixed together harden into a rubber-like compound. There are a whole host of brands and different types and subtypes, all with different material properties, but there's a few easy golden rules to remember. Rule 1, once mixed, you can never go back. Rule 2, once mixed, you only have as long as the pot life to get your silicon poured. Rule 3, the pot life is always a lie. And Rule 4, never mix different classes of silicon in the same mold. So with those rules 100% established and discussed, I'd like you all to take a guess on which rules I break, and in so doing, completely myself. In the meantime, let's get our masters ready for casting. Now in last week's video, we carved this wonderful modular stairwell system out of extruded polystyrene, and before we're ready to just dump a bunch of silicon on it, there are some crucial steps we need to follow. First, these pieces are going to be cast, which means that every detail we cram into this master will pay serious dividends, so it's time for some ultra fine detailing. So I grabbed my scalpel and my alfoil and carefully examined every square inch of the surface and carved as many micro textures as possible. Little cracks and chips snaking their way across the surface, going to much greater lengths than I normally would. With that done, the pieces are looking fantastic, but there's one final step. When we pour silicon on these masters, the gooey pink tide will find its way into every crack and crevice, and if it goes in somewhere too deep that we don't want it to, it can tear while demolding and risk damaging part of the silicon we do care about. So every hole and gape and crevice needs to be filled. I tried a new method for this on this project and it worked phenomenally. What better way to grout your stonework than with real grout? I simply put PVA glue in all the cracks I wanted to fill, dumped a whole bunch of grout on the piece, and then blew off the excess. This grout will automatically cure from the moisture in the glue, but if any is still loose, just give it a light spray with some matte scenic sealant. Now our masters are ready.
This is where the fun begins.
I always pour silicon and resin on a nice flat glass casting plane. It's easy to level and easy to clean. I glued down each master with double-sided tape and fast-drying PVA. Then we need to build our mold boxes. These are the structure that holds our silicon so we can pour it onto our masters. For our nice big rectangle platform, this is super easy. Some foam core board and a bunch of hot glue and she's basically ready to pour. For our stairs, it's not so simple. Because of the complicated shapes of the stairs, if we simply pour silicon into a rectangle, we're going to have a huge chunk of silicon in all the negative space above the lower stairs. This is not only a huge waste of money, it also makes demolding a nightmare, so I engineered 2 pretty complicated shapes outlining the form of the stairwells with a 5mm spacing away from any surface to allow for a nice snug mold with no wasted silicon. You'll also notice that all of my mold walls are between 5 and 10mm millimeters thick. Now this is conventionally terrible mold design, as the molds will have low strength and be prone to tearing at the top edges, but I'm not making a mold to cast hundreds of copies for an industrial application. I need the cheapest mold possible to make about 10 copies, and I'll be casting in such a way that the low strength of the wobbly mold isn't an issue. More on that a little bit later. Once all the mold boxes are done, it's time to spray the entire master and the box interior with mold release. 60 hours of sculpting and mold boxing all comes down to this. If the silicon leaks, I will not get the masters out without damaging them, and all of this will be for nothing. We've got one shot at this. It's time to pour some silicon. Today I'm working with a new silicon for me, going for Moldmax Umu 30, as my normal beloved Pinky Sil from Barnes is out of stock. This silicon is supposed to be a little friendlier to work with, as it has a comfortable 30-minute pot life and is meant to have a nice low viscosity, perfect for getting into all the nooks and crannies of these crazy tight mold boxes. The only stock I could get were these little 1 kilo kits, so I'm going to start by combining 2 of them. First up, I stirred the absolute crap out of them and then dumped them into my mixing tub, preparing the most viscous, that is the thickest part first, and then the runnier half second. As soon as that second mixture hits our tub, the time is ticking. Now straight away, this doesn't feel right. This stuff is a lot thicker than Pinky Sil that I'm used to, which is normal for the other smooth-on silicons I've used, but I thought this stuff was meant to be thin. Well, no time to turn back. There's $100 of silicon in this tub right now. For better or worse, it's going on a mold. I tried to get in nice and quickly. Even though the pot life is 30 minutes, it's still going to be runnier early on, so into the top stairwell it goes. You can't see it from here, but I'm currently standing on my table, lifting the tub high in the air to get a long pour line to stretch out the silicon as it falls and pop any bubbles. So I don't know if you guys can see, but it looks like the silicon isn't moving all the way down properly inside the mold box, which means that perhaps some air is getting trapped in here. Now I might be able to fix that by sort of peeling away pieces of the box and putting more silicon on and doing a huge dodgy patch job in the future, but right now our problem is I need more silicon. So I emptied the other 2 bottles of silicon, managing to finish the mold for stair 1 and getting about half of the big platform done, and then jumped in the car and struck north for the closest silicon within 200 kilometers. Silicon acquired, but now I have a 2-hour drive back, which should be about 6 hours in peak traffic.
Times already this morning to the dead.
An absolutely brutal drive home, and it was time to keep on pouring. Now Pinky Sil is amazing because it's super runny, which is perfect for these mold boxes, but the cure time is only 6 minutes. So I'm working a lot faster. The first batch went into the second stairwell and about half filled it, but before continuing, I thought I'd see if my suspicions were right and started ripping up the mold box of stairwell 1. And sure enough, as I suspected, the thick viscosity of the Umu 30 hadn't been able to make it all the way down into the bottom section of the mold. I don't even think this was air getting trapped. The silicon was just too thick. So time to mix up the next batch and pour it in to fill the gaps in the first mold and finish off the second stairwell of Pinky Sil. Now I know you're all screaming into the comments, what about Rule 4, Lockie? Well, I was pretty sure that these 2 brands were both condensation cure silicon of the same class, and I did a little spot test first and they bonded together perfectly. So away we went pouring. Rule 4 doesn't apply here. I was super careful to make sure the silicon was getting in all the nooks and crannies from the failed Umu pour, and then finished off the Pinky Sil stairs. Luckily the Pinky Sil cures really quickly, so it's demolding time. Starting off with the mold I'm most confident in, the pure Pinky Sil lowest stairwell. Getting the molds off the glass was a bitch, and deconstructing my mold box was a serious task, but with that stripped back, she's looking good. Now it's time to dig out the master. This is a savage process, so abandon all hope of saving your master. The sculpt gets absolutely shredded, but you do get some fantastic pieces for future ruins. After using my pliers to pry out the deepest chunks of foam, I was pretty excited to see one sexy operational mold. So far, so good. Mold box 2 did not go so well. I didn't double check the labels, and they are different types of silicon and they do not join together, and I'm not even demolding this at the moment. This is just a swirl of both silicon types. It's mostly completely going to separate. As soon as I try and pull that mold apart, I think all that silicon's going in the bin, and that is like hundreds of dollars of silicon. So I just don't have the heart to deal with any of this. I'm gonna go to bed, have a weekend off, and try and find some solution on Monday to salvage maybe at least this. But I think that's cooked. So after a restful weekend where I definitely didn't repeatedly sneak away to my office to stare at the molds and shudder with anxiety, I decided to start in a happy place and test the lower stairwell mold. Firstly, I built a mold box to go around the mold to support it during casting so that it wouldn't lose its shape beneath the weight of the resin, and it also helps keep it level for pouring. I then made a foam spacer that matched the volumetric profile of the internals of the stairwell that I could submerge into the curing resin without it touching any of the surface detail. This helps bulk out the mold and save a fortune on resin and weight. Some more mold release and she's ready for resin. Easy cast polyurethane resin is absolutely the way to go. It sets super fast, demolds in 10 minutes, and it's super runny, so it really catches great detail. This is a 2-part 1-to-1 mix by volume, which is really easy to do, but unfortunately, in an effort to minimize waste, I used some white expanded polystyrene for my foam spacer rather than the orange extruded like I normally do, and this soaked up resin like a sponge. It's much more porous, and after some further successful casts, I worked out that this mistake increased the resin of this particular cast by 300%. That is a crazy budget blowout on this single piece of stairs, but luckily we did get an overall win. The cast has come out like a dream and demolded beautifully, and the mold has held up super well. The detail captured was amazing, and I cannot wait to cast more. Now it's time to deal with the easiest of the mold failures, the upper stairwell. I decided to try and rebuild a profile of the master, which is of course has now been ripped to pieces, by doing a partial cast using the pinky seal part of the mold in resin. This would be a nightmare to do long term, but if I struggle through once, I might be able to save and rebuild the mold. I lined up the two mold halves as best as possible and jammed in a bunch of offcuts to block up the mold and tied it up with string. Then in goes our resin, again with a foam spacer. Some of the resin did leak into that lower chamber, but not a great amount, and I can just leave that in there for the first real cast. With the master hopefully reborn, I leveled off the offcuts, peeled off the pinky seal components, and cleaned up the join as best I could so there was no resin remaining on that Umu mold face. I need as best bond as possible there between the next Umu layer so that join doesn't become a weak spot later on. I had to clean up a bunch of bubbles with green stuff, and then I set it all down on the molding plane and built a pretty dodgy new mold box, but just around that end of the mold, and then I just put hot glue everywhere. Then a whole new batch of the Umu silicon went in, and I left it overnight and crossed my fingers. The following morning, the mold box comes away, the bond looks good on the outer face, but the real test is the demolding. There is no point in being gentle here. If it's going to work, it needs to work properly, and voila! Master 2.0 removed and looking alright. Definitely a visible mold line that will sadly be on every cast, but that's better than no cast at all. So back to the casting bench with a foam spacer, this time from extruded poly, and in goes our resin. I'm really trying to be conservative here as I'm running scarily low on resin already, so keeping the foam spacer in the perfect spot is key, but luckily the resin grabs it firm really quickly. A quick demold and the pain was worth it. A beautifully functional mold. 2 down, 1 to go, and it's the worst of all. It's time to bite the bullet and look at the platform. I demolded this as gently as possible, saving the foam master in case I needed to build a whole brand new mold. And it's in pretty poor condition, but I think we might have something that's just workable, if only for a few casts. With the mold box around it, I'm feeling more hopeful, and once it's reassembled on the casting bench and all the breaks in the mold are smoothed over by hand, I'm ready to pour. A massive foam spacer in this guy, and a lot of resin, and then it's time to demold. This is where it could all come undone, and it did, quite literally. As I pulled out the cast, the mold separated extensively in many places, but to my surprise, when I put it all back in the mold box, I was able to reconstruct it like a jigsaw puzzle of silicon. There was a lot more flash and mold lines on the cast than I'd like, but this piece doesn't really matter. It's just a big box of stone stuff for other stuff to interact with. Well, that's one successful cast of each mold. Time to smash out a whole bunch of them. And I'm out of resin. Well, that's one successful cast of each mold. Time to smash out a whole bunch of them. At first, this seemed to be a pretty painless experience, but soon I hit yet another snag. This Umu 30 stuff, absolute garbage. I've gotten a massive tear in the center of the upper stairwell mold, right in the thickest and strongest part of the mold, all part of the original pour. It's simply a point of torsion in the demolding because of the protrusion of a windowsill. Pinky sill would never tear from such a small torsive stress, and now each time I'm casting this piece, I have to make sure this ever-growing tear is aligned. Luckily, the nature of my amazing casting mold box with foam supports keeps it in compression during the pour, so very little resin leaks from the tear. The platform is faring even worse. With every pour, more of the mold is damaged irreversibly and refuses to realign properly, and after 3 casts it's in pretty awful condition. And then I hit the final hurdle. After a brand new 10 kilo kit of resin arriving in the morning, by the afternoon it's almost all gone, and I've only cast 3 platforms, 4 upper stairwells and 1 lower stairwell. The platforms were sucking a huge amount of resin without me really even noticing it, and for goodness, they're the least important part of the build. So, I'm all out of resin again. I think maybe this guy got finished. We'll have to wait and see when we demold him, but that is well short of the amount of casts I wanted to get out of those drums. But I'm not buying any more. We're just gonna leave it with what we've got for this project. So there we have the summation of my efforts so far. What began as an attempt to trade in labor time at the expense of some high quality materials rapidly descended into a costly affair. The process was still faster than if I'd sculpted those pieces by hand, and if I make further casts, that will be even more true. But the raw cost of my mistakes and miscalculations has been staggering. $1,500 in materials to yield those 3 molds and 11 casts is not a good return, even before the cost of labor is considered. But on the upside, I cannot wait to see how these stairs look up against the walls. But with our first Minas Tirith event only just around the corner, I'm going to need some help to get this first sector of the city ready for battle on time. But more on that in a couple of weeks. Remember, if you're keen to help the channel and make me not want to cry on the floor of my studio at the sheer mismanagement of this project, check out my Patreon linked down below. In 2 weeks' time, I'm giving away a fully painted Treebeard miniature to one of my lucky Patreons, and there's fortnightly chances to score yourself some goodies on our Battle Games in Middle-earth live stream. Subscribe if you're new around here, and let me know down in the comments if you're thinking about using some silicon casting for any of your own builds in the future. That's it for now, guys. Lockie out.